Okay. All right, I can hear myself. Are we ready? Okay. So I'm going to be talking about the gamified web. Gamification basically is taking gamified elements, stuff from games, and applying them to a non-game system. And the reason that they do that is to increase motivation, increase engagement, and hopefully increase productivity if it's for the workforce or to modify behavior or for marketing and things like that. Most of my sources here come from a course from Coursera, Gamification with the University of Pennsylvania with Dr. Kevin Warbach. I really highly recommend the course. It goes pretty in-depth into psychology, which is my field, and I think is very interesting. So the ultimate goal with gamification is to enhance the system and make it more fun, so that's engaging, but it's still functional at the same time. I think what a lot of people do when they use these gamified elements, they're doing it in a sort of shallow way, and maybe they'll get like a little steep peak, but motivation will drop in time, and it's not really a well-sustained system. So typical motivation might look like this for someone. It starts out pretty high. You have lots of peaks and valleys, and then gradually it just decreases and decreases over time. And then with games, however, you have an onboarding process, and then things are super easy, and it's easy to get into the game. And then things get gradually more difficult over time, and so it becomes more motivating. And as you climb up and you climb up, maybe you're defeating little minions and things like that, and then you go up to a boss fight, and the boss is, much more difficult, and then you keep going on. And in a lot of games, there's a really big boss fight at the end, the overhanging boss. It's almost like binge watching a really good show. Maybe the first episode doesn't grab you, but as you keep going on and things get more complex, it gets more and more interesting, and you get hooked better over time. So using these tactics for motivation can make a huge difference. This article is describing a game called Fold It, which was developed by scientists who are trying to solve this puzzle with the HIV enzyme for research. And they had been stumped about this protein, how it's folded, for about a decade. And so they created this game, and it's just an excellent example of crowdsourcing. And the gamers solved this riddle within 3 weeks. It's something that stumped scientists for a decade. I think that's pretty significant. And so when we talk about, I'm sorry, I don't have this totally pulled up. So when we talk about motivation, there's this spectrum between extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. And you always want to try to go on the side of intrinsic motivation. Extrinsic means basically you have to do it. This external regulation over there on the very left is just something that you have to do. You don't want to do it at all, but you're having the finger pointed at you, and you have to do it. Introjection may mean that it's something like a status thing for you. You want other people to look at you and see you as something, but you don't really necessarily want to do that. And identification may mean you think of it as a good idea. It's a logical thing for you to do, but you don't necessarily want to do it either. And then integration may mean, yeah, you want to do it, but you still kind of need a push to get you in the right direction. Okay, and then here's an example from a book by Gabe Zickerman. It's called Gamification by Design. Here's a quote: "Intrinsic motivators create greatness, while extrinsic motivators are nothing more than pellets dropped for rats in a cage." So when we see something that has all these extrinsic motivators, these rewards and these flashy, shiny things, we kind of know that we're being manipulated, and it's a little bit degrading. And sometimes rewards can be demotivating. So if a child plays piano for the inherent joy of doing so, then begins to win competitions and subsequently loses, she will stop playing piano. That is, extrinsic rewards crush intrinsic motivation, which never returns. And sometimes this may be the case. And punishment can be worse. The punishment is also an extrinsic motivator in a way for some people. And they've done studies where daycares that start to punish parents for being late to pick up their kids, they may have a fine tacked on to how many minutes they're late. They actually find that the parents are late more often than they were before, because what you're doing is you're taking away this intrinsic motivation to be there on time for the sake of it, for the sake of your child, for the sake of the workers, and you're putting this extrinsic motivator on there as a punishment. And so parents will kind of weigh the options and say, well, maybe I'll just go ahead and pay the extra $15, to have this extra 15 minutes on this problem that I have at work that I really want to solve right now. So anyway, they take this intrinsic motivation away. Okay. So how do you build intrinsic motivation? Self-determination theory has 3 components: competency, autonomy, and relatedness. So completing challenges, receiving affirmations that are tied to those challenges, tied to the behavior. There's one website that does this really, really well. Can anyone think of a website that does this really, really well? What's that? Reddit? Well, I have Reddit as an example of something else, but the example I have here is freeCodeCamp. freeCodeCamp does this really well. Every time you complete a challenge, there's a little pop-up with a little graphic that spins around, and it gives you affirmations. And they're always tied to the behavior, and what you click on is submit and go to the next challenge. It's always about the next challenge. Okay, so more about competence, maintaining interest. So when you're learning something, ideally, you have this new skill that comes along that you want to learn, you put in effort, and ideally, over time, you get this unconscious competence. Now, with programming, that takes an exceedingly long time to go get next to that new skill, and maybe over time, if you fall back, you won't have that unconscious competence again. It'll take a little bit more to get it back. So keeping experts hooked on a system once they receive mastery, continued creativity, getting people to solve the problems that you have, getting these experts to help you along the way. There's also mentorship. Sometimes when people teach others, they're more motivated and they actually learn more in the process than maybe the people that they're mentoring. And then the sunk cost fallacy, that's kind of a devious way to motivate people, but it can be effective. The sunk cost fallacy applies, like if you're in a job for a very long time, you invested a long time, you've put in a lot of effort, you put in all these years, and you see a job that you want on the horizon, and you're holding out for that possibility for that job. You may see other jobs that you may enjoy more, but you might stick with the job that you have because you don't want to leave because of all that time you've invested and how close you are to this other opportunity. So that's something that you may be able to use, the sunk cost fallacy, in a system like this, helping people, getting them into mentorship. You've completed all this time, so why don't you do this? Okay, and then autonomy. I'm going to talk a little bit about the game Zelda for this. Zelda, one of the games that I played several times over and over again was the Ocarina of Time. And the thing about it is the decisions were pretty much predetermined. You couldn't get ahead. You couldn't skip ahead. You couldn't really choose which way you were going to go to progress in the game. For example, like there's the water temple, which everyone really hates, but it's a good example. You have to have this tunic, the blue tunic that helps you breathe underwater, and you have to have the iron boots to get into the temple. And you have to be throughout this, you have to progress through the game in this specific order in order to get that item, those items, in order to get there. You can't just skip ahead. But in the newest game of Zelda, I think it's called Breath of the Wild, it's an open world, and people can explore in their own way. They can make choices, they have the freedom, and they can also explore other interests and other specialties along the way. There's more choices. Okay, and then relatedness. Gabe Zickerman talks in his TED Talk about feedback, friends, and fun. It's important for friends to be able to share the feedback that they get for completing these challenges and other things like that. And another thing about relatedness is it's not just necessarily a social gathering, but maybe part of being something bigger. So I think you saw that, with the game Fold It. People were very motivated to play the game and to figure out the puzzle because it was something bigger than themselves. Okay, and then another piece of relatedness, cooperation wins over competition. I think this is kind of counterintuitive for some people, but that's what some game developers believe. And an example of this is a game called Overwatch. And Overwatch focuses more on the positives. So in a lot of games, you see the stats at the end, and it's all comparative. All the players, this person did this much, but this person did more. What Overwatch does is a little bit different because it displays stats that are related to each player, and it's the best stats of their game. Okay, so the elements, dynamics, mechanics, components, going up from a higher level with dynamics, and then components being what you see. This is what you want to think of when you're designing the game system. Okay, so dynamics are the rules or the constraints of the system. What you want to think about with reinforcement, what's the schedule of reinforcement? Hopefully you have some unpredictability with the reinforcement, because when people are reinforced in a predictable way, it's not very motivating. What's the narrative? This is a big part of it. Who are your players? What's their experience? What are their demographics? What motivates them? And the progression, what do you want people to achieve? Okay, and the mechanics, this is like the actions that are completed. The challenges, cooperation, giving feedback. There's my example of Reddit, the karma. People can upvote or downvote you, and that's an example of feedback. And it also gives you kind of a status. People have, stars or, whatever. That's not Reddit, but anyway. So components, gifting, levels, quests, collections, unlocked content for those people who are mastering something. These are all the components that you see in a system. Okay, it's really important to not forget the fun elements in a gamified system. That's kind of the whole point. So I'm going to show some elements that maybe you can incorporate in a website design. Surprises. Surprises are really important because people get bored really easily. So you want to have, we're naturally attracted to novelty, and variety enriches our lives. And so, having like giveaways or having that random schedule of reinforcement, that feedback, that's really important. Identity with avatars. This helps encourage people to be committed to the system as well. It encourages a little bit of creativity, getting to pick what they look like, how they present themselves. And creativity, again, just people can put a little of their own stamp on something. That's important. They feel like an individual when they can put a little creativity and a little fun into something. Easy onboarding, this is really important. So what you don't want is for people to right away have to register for this on this complicated form. You want people to get started. You want people to be easy. Plants vs. Zombies is a really good example of this. You start out with just 2 plants that you can plant, and there's not very many zombies that come along. It's very easy. You kind of get to figure out how the game works. Another thing that I want to say about this, and that I didn't include on my slides, is it's important also to have easy failures and to model mistakes as you go along. In games, there's easy failure, there's easy way to bounce back, and easy failure and bouncing back is an important element to getting people to work really hard. Okay, and then easy onboarding, again, having a sitemap, some way for people to navigate, maybe a button that says start here and gives examples of how you can get started in the system. And another thing is bots. The Slack bot kind of shows you how to work Slack. And there's different bots that can teach you a lot of different things on websites. Completing challenges and having something that comes up, something graphical, something interesting that comes up. Another example of challenges, quizzes, and people can share their results of the challenges that they've completed, the feedback that they've been given. Something to consider with the social media buttons is you may want to just have 2 or 3, because if you have too many, then people won't share anything. This is a reason that you want to know what your players like too, because different types of people like different social medias. Okay, leveling and progression. This is kind of a dry example, but on this form, it shows that you're 50% complete. So really, you just have to do this, and then you'll be done. And here's more of an interesting example with a little bit of nostalgia, which is fun. One thing I will say about progression bars is that it's kind of like going back to the whole competition and leaderboards thing. Leaderboards can be kind of demotivating for some people if they're not at the very, very top. And progression bars, it's kind of the same thing. If people aren't like 90% of the way completed, they're not really that motivated by a progression bar. If you show somebody at 12%, they're going to be like, well, I'm hardly there at all. But if you show them like, oh, you're 90% of the way, you've only got that 10% left, that might be more motivating for people to actually complete the challenge. Okay, so here's an integrated example that Dr. Warbach talked about. Just all of the elements. Obviously, you can't have every single element in a system, and hopefully it's thoughtfully designed. Okay, and so here's how you can educate yourself further. There's a link to the Coursera course and a couple of Udemy courses. And then here's some examples of TED Talks. Jane McGonigal there, she talks about her game Super Better, and that's a really, really good example of gamification, and it's kind of an inspiring story. Some articles there from Forbes that are very recent. I tried to put up recent ones there for marketing, the workplace, and education too is very interesting. And then if you have Netflix, Bill Nye Saves the World, Season 1, Episode 7, he talks about, it's really a serious game, but it's really interesting and it's a really good example of how somebody can do a game really well and make it not necessarily look like the intended purpose. It's kind of disguised what it actually does. So I'll just leave you in suspense there with that. And I just want to say thank you for listening to my talk, and I hope that this will inspire you to take these principles and motivate people in the future. Thank you.